Hello friends, welcome to AI Flux. So this past week has been kind of a rough week for ChatGPT4, and for a number of reasons I actually almost canceled my subscription entirely. But let's get into why and kind of what's going on with OpenAI. A lot of things have happened. The world of AI is moving very quickly, and things generally change very quickly. But a while ago, OpenAI's ChatGPT was a huge success. It was 98% accurate. Now it's facing sort of some tougher times. So basically a group of researchers recently released a paper on Archive, a research paper where using science and statistics, they showed that the noticeable performance and reliability of ChatGPT4 and 3.5 have actually decreased substantially. So one example of this is that the ability for ChatGPT4 to produce executable code on its first shot compared to now and when it was released. So now it's actually about 40% lower in terms of how good it is at producing code that can actually be used. There are also people who have noticed that the prose it creates is not quite as good, that it asks more questions. And on top of that, there's the issue of performance and downtime. So initially, it's probably pretty okay to assume that a lot of the downtime was just from scaling, but now there's downtime for even new features like browsing and plugins, which is kind of weird, right? Because you'd think that these features are seen as a value add and that it would be top priority to make sure they work. And yet, just a few days after they were released, they're disabled, they're limited. And you have to start questioning, how serious is OpenAI about these tools? And if we're still paying the same amount of money for them and they're getting not as good with more people using them, it's valid to wonder why. And we're not going to cover too much of this paper in depth in this video, but if you'd like us to, let us know. So the reason I almost canceled my account was I was also noticing a big drop in ChatGPT4's performance in particular. In this paper, they mentioned that they noticed that the accuracy, specifically in math and reasoning, went from, in certain cases, the benchmark that they made in March, all the way down to only 2% of that benchmark. So a few of these were, for instance, exit exams for the Stanford MBA program. Some of these were high school math exams. And people were surprised and were kind of wondering, what is going wrong with this AI model? And rightly so. It was also pretty newsworthy when OpenAI decided to actually turn off ChatGPT's ability to browse the internet with Bing. And before, ChatGPT4 could really grab real-time information, its answers really weren't as good. And there's sort of a question of, how much of this capability is really coming from GPT-4 and how much of it is really coming from its ability to gather more information. And on top of that, there was a curious metric actually released by Microsoft, which was that in May, the overall traffic of people using ChatGPT went down by about 10%, and it's actually continued to go down month over month. Now, why is this? There are a few pretty good guesses. There are some questions of, what things might be going on at OpenAI that are causing this. And ultimately, there's the question of, is the moat to LLM tools, moat just being, the hook that gets people who aren't just technically interested in these models and people who might just see value in them, has that sort of run its course? Is everyone who just wanted to try ChatGPT, have they done that and then thought, it's okay, but I'm not going to pay $30 a month for it? And the more important question is, if they're not willing to pay $30 a month for something that was seemingly, groundbreaking just a few months ago, if it's not actually profitable for Microsoft to run this tool, if they're not going to pay more than $30 a month, then there's a question of if the product actually works and if the whole concept of OpenAI as a company really even works. The future is unclear. I think it's too early to call winners and losers right now because it hasn't even been out for a year. OpenAI is still a very new company in terms of them being known as the purveyors of GPT-4. So let's get into sort of some of the deeper reasoning here as to why usage may have actually gone down. That might be not that surprising. So in the face of declining usage of ChatGPT since May, there are a few reasons why this might actually be happening, and they're pretty speculative. So the first one is a big drop-off in educational use during some break. So college students and high school students aren't really having to fake writing papers anymore. They don't need more help learning things or even using GPT for productive things. But this might actually point to deeper issues with the interface, and it has to do with how well Gen Z is when it comes to writing and just using natural language in general. It's kind of interesting that younger people have been glued to a phone since they were 3 years old. So you'd think that they might be better at actually using this kind of chat interface, but ironically, older generations are, I would say, much more articulate and can actually use text more creatively and just have a better corpus of ways to use that kind of natural language. So there's a question there. There's also a question of maybe LLMs and just ChatGPT in general is reaching the plateau of its hype cycle. So we've reached kind of the initial big hype, and now we're about to hit the trough of who's actually still using it and who's actually still finding hype in this entire realm of tools. The initial excitement might just be subsiding as people realize that the practical uses for these interfaces is just more narrow and maybe not as good as they initially thought. Or they've maybe just gotten better at what they were doing with the help of these tools, and now they just don't really need them as much. And that said, there have still been huge advances in enterprise software. Like Stripe is using LLMs, Salesforce is integrating them. There have even been advances in healthcare and even in physical sciences, like coming up with new chemicals and new biosciences approaches using AI-based systems. However, a lot of these aren't exactly ChatGPT or derivative products of Microsoft's OpenAI investment. And there's also a question of how maybe we've just been productizing LLMs and these chat tools wrong, right? I think early on, it's pretty safe to argue that Microsoft took an approach with OpenAI, which was, if you make the models and these AIs as widely applicable as possible in terms of their capabilities, so let them do prose, let them do math, let them do programming, the idea there is then you don't have to waste the headache of understanding how to actually create discrete products from these, right? So discrete products would be like a coding tool and a writing tool. And curiously, Microsoft has actually had a pretty closed source approach in comparison to other companies, especially Stability AI. Stability curiously releases a lot of stuff open source, and they've been very quick to productize as much of it as possible. So for instance, ClipDrop, although it's kind of just a wrapper around Stable Diffusion, actually creates a lot of distinct fine-tunes and breaks out very explicit, narrow features of that that are then productized as part of ClipDrop. I think some would also argue that Facebook or Meta has created their notion of this, which is they're releasing base models that are general and base models that are chat models. And that's already altered the way that developers are using these tools and that companies are implementing Llama, which has only been out for a few days now. And as far as consumers are concerned generally, they're choosing which of these products to use and how to use these tools, and ultimately they decide how much they will pay to use these tools. And Microsoft made a really bold move last week, and they released sort of some early ideas of how much they'd want to charge for this, at least for business use. So we're not sure what this is. It's probably not a coding tool, but they alluded to baking some of this into, say, a form of Microsoft Office. And they were saying that for businesses using this, they would like to see people paying between $5 and $10 an hour for using these tools. There's a question there of whether or not they're just trying to see like what money they can wring out of people, or if surprisingly, none of this is profitable at all, and they're just trying to find desperately a way to at least even break even. And right now, we do know that as of April, even before a lot of the growth that happened at OpenAI, it cost in like hard infrastructure costs, so not even borrowing to buy more hardware, it cost over $1 million a day just to run ChatGPT, which is pretty wild. It's not a huge number enterprise-wise, but that is a massive number. So Microsoft, at this point is trying to figure out, how do we make back some of that and then make our investments in infrastructure and GPUs and everything actually worthwhile going forward. And there's also the question of, if their investments in scaling have actually panned out, right? Because obviously, if less people are using this and people are closing their accounts, then the scaling doesn't really mean anything, because the only reason you see value in and like a return from that is when more people are using it and more people are actually paying for it. And there's a big if there, right? We don't really know. And there is also a potential, we don't know this, but there is a potential that in terms of just the structure of the AI model that backs ChatGPT and all of its expert models, there is a possibility that maybe it just doesn't work as well in a scaled, larger amalgam of models. Like maybe ChatGPT was just smartest when it was only being used by a few million people and was deployed, say, in a single data center. Very likely that could have been the case, and maybe someone will get around that, maybe they'll find a solution here, but largely we just don't know. And the question, going forward is like, what should they do to actually make this better, right? Is it accuracy? Is it performance? Is it speed? And is it maybe just user experience? I mean, for me, like looking at those, a lot of those words seem kind of interchangeable, because to me, user experience is all about accuracy and speed. Performance is kind of a relative gray term here. The biggest risk here for Microsoft and OpenAI is letting ChatGPT stagnate and not look as good as other even open source or locally runnable tools that are targeting coding or only targeting writing long form text. Llama is a great example of, showing things that we thought ChatGPT could only do a few months ago, now that you can do on your MacBook. So there are big questions here, and I'm curious to hear what you guys think. So have you almost canceled your ChatGPT subscription? Are you still using it? Does it seem slower? Are you annoyed that it's been going down all the time? I've also linked to some cool tools in the description below. And yeah, so as always, if you like this video, please like and subscribe. We hope you learned something, and we'll see you in the next video.